"If your daughter can translate this, I'll double your salary," said the female billionaire CEO to the single father. The fluorescent lights of Portland Regional Hospital cast harsh shadows across Robert Foster's weathered face as he stared down at his daughter's medical report. At 42, his calloused hands, marked by 2 decades of mechanical work, gripped the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. 8-year-old Sophie sat beside him on the vinyl waiting room chair, her small frame hunched over a second-hand tablet, the screen's glow illuminating her delicate features in the dark circles beneath her bright blue eyes. The neurologist had been clear. Sophie's rare neurological disorder was progressing faster than anticipated. The experimental treatment in Switzerland offered hope, but at $200,000, with no insurance coverage, it might as well have been $20 million. Robert had already taken on double shifts at the construction site, sold his prized vintage Harley, and still barely made a dent in their mounting medical bills. Sophie looked up suddenly, her attention drawn to a woman pacing near the reception desk. The woman wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of Robert's salary. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she spoke rapidly into her phone, switching effortlessly between what sounded like English, Mandarin, and something that might have been Portuguese. "Dad," Sophie whispered, tugging at Robert's worn flannel sleeve. "That lady with the nice shoes is really worried, not about money but about people who need clean water." Robert glanced at his daughter, then at the woman. It was something Sophie did sometimes, reading people with an uncanny accuracy that the doctors couldn't explain. A side effect of her condition, they suggested, as certain neural pathways deteriorated while others strengthened to compensate. "The Brazilian contract is worthless if we can't decode their technical specifications," the woman snapped into her phone. "I've spent 6 months and $300,000 on translators who can't even grasp the cultural nuances embedded in their engineering documents." Sophie watched the woman with the same intense focus she applied to her language puzzles. Her eyes tracked the woman's gestures, the micro-expressions flickering across her face, the tension in her shoulders. The woman ended her call and noticed them watching. Her sharp green eyes softened slightly when they landed on Sophie, but hardened again when she saw Robert's construction site uniform and the duct tape holding his work boots together. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Your daughter. She was listening to my conversation." Robert instinctively moved protectively in front of Sophie. "She doesn't understand Portuguese, ma'am. We're just waiting for the doctor." The woman's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "Portuguese? I was speaking Mandarin for the last 2 minutes." She knelt down to Sophie's level, her expression shifting to something Robert couldn't quite read. "Sweetheart, what did you think I was talking about?" Sophie looked up at her father for permission. Robert nodded reluctantly. "You're upset because the people you hired can't understand the hidden meanings in the documents," Sophie said quietly. "They know the words, but they don't know the feelings behind them. Like when my dad says, 'I'm fine,' but his eyes say he's worried about something." The woman's composure cracked for just a moment. She stood slowly, her gaze never leaving Sophie's face. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie Foster. I'm 8 3/4. And you understood what I was saying in Mandarin?" Sophie nodded matter-of-factly. "You need someone who can read between the lines. The Brazilian engineers aren't just giving you technical specifications. They're testing whether you respect their culture enough to understand their subtle warnings about implementation challenges." The waiting room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. The woman stared at Sophie as if seeing a ghost, then looked up at Robert with an expression he'd never seen on another person's face, a mixture of desperation and hope that mirrored his own constant state. "Mr. Foster," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to make you an offer." Robert's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "How do you know my name?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "Foster? Robert Foster? U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Afghanistan deployment 2010-2014? The mechanic who redesigned the water filtration system at Forward Base Alpha when all the engineers couldn't fix it?" Robert blinked in surprise. "That was a long time ago. How would you know about that?" "I was there. Civilian contractor. Catherine Reynolds. You saved our operation when you jury-rigged that filtration system during the dust storm. I never forget someone who can solve problems that the so-called experts can't. Catherine Reynolds' corner office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Reynolds Water Solutions building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of downtown Portland in the distant mountains. Robert had never been this high in a building before, though ironically he'd helped install the plumbing system in this very tower 2 years earlier. Sophie pressed her face against the glass, completely fearless, while Robert felt acutely aware of his work boots scuffing the pristine marble floor. "The contract is worth $50 million, Catherine said, sliding a thick folder across her mahogany desk. "But it's written in technical Portuguese, with cultural references that require not just translation, but interpretation. I've lost 3 potential deals this year because American translators miss the nuanced meanings." Robert flipped through pages of incomprehensible text mixed with engineering diagrams. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't understand why you're showing us this. Because your daughter understood my phone conversation better than linguists with doctorate degrees." Catherine pulled out her phone and showed them a recording. This is a snippet of the Brazilian engineer explaining their water purification system. "Listen." The Portuguese flowed like music, but Robert caught Sophie's eyes widening as she focused intently on the screen. "He's not just explaining the system," Sophie said quietly. "He's warning about the rainy season. He says the filtration works perfectly in their tests, but he's worried it might fail when the heavy rains come because they haven't tested it in real conditions. He's being polite, but he's basically saying your American engineers are rushing too much." Catherine's hands stilled on her phone. The American team projected a 6-month implementation timeline. "The Brazilian engineer thinks that's crazy," Sophie continued. "He says it should take at least 18 months to do it right, but he's too polite to say that directly. That's why he keeps mentioning the seasonal challenges. It's his way of saying you need to slow down." Robert watched his daughter translate not just words but intentions, cultural context, and unspoken concerns. How had he never realized the depth of what Sophie could do? "My daughter needs medical treatment," Robert said carefully. "Experimental therapy in Switzerland. It costs $200,000 and insurance won't cover it." Catherine leaned back in her leather chair, studying them both. If Sophie can successfully translate this entire contract, not just the words, but the cultural nuances, the implied concerns, the real timeline they're suggesting, I'll double your current salary and provide full medical coverage for Sophie's treatment. Robert's construction site salary was $38,000 a year. Doubling it would be life-changing, but still nowhere near enough for Sophie's treatment. That's very generous, but plus a bonus of $300,000 if the deal goes through successfully because of her translations. The office fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 42 floors below. Robert felt like he was drowning and someone had just thrown him a life preserver, but he couldn't quite reach it. "She's 8 years old," he whispered. "She's extraordinary," Catherine replied. "The question is, are you willing to let her be?" Sophie looked up from the contract pages she'd been studying. "Dad, this isn't just about water purification. They want to build something that will help people in places where water makes children sick. Like my brain makes me sick, but different." Robert's throat constricted. Sophie's condition was degenerative. Without treatment, she had maybe 2 years before the symptoms became unmanageable. But here she was, talking about helping other sick children. "If I can help," Sophie said softly, "shouldn't I try?" Before we continue with this amazing story, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical for Portland in late September. Robert had barely slept, alternating between excitement and terror about what they'd agreed to. Sophie sat at their tiny kitchen table, the thick contract spread before her like a treasure map, her expression more serious than any 8-year-old should have to be. "The first section is about water quality standards," she said, tracing her finger along lines of Portuguese text. "But they keep using the word confiança. It means trust, but they're using it in a special way." Robert poured coffee into a chipped mug, watching his daughter work with an intensity that both amazed and worried him. "What kind of special way?" "They're saying they need to trust that the Americans will respect their environmental concerns." See here, Sophie pointed to a paragraph. They mentioned the Amazon basin 6 times, but not because of water sources. They're worried about the impact on indigenous communities. Robert leaned over Sophie's shoulder, his mechanic's mind automatically translating the technical diagrams in ways his daughter couldn't. Look at this pressure valve configuration. It's all wrong for tropical conditions. During heavy rains, this would create back pressure and potentially contaminate the entire system. Sophie looked up at her father with new appreciation. You understand the technical parts that I don't. 20 years of fixing things gives you a sense of how systems break, Robert replied with a shrug. In Afghanistan, we had to redesign the entire water filtration system because the engineers never accounted for dust storms clogging the intake valves. Fancy degrees don't teach you what happens when theory meets real-world conditions. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. How's the translation progressing? Need anything? Robert typed back. Sophie says they're concerned about indigenous communities. Also, pressure valve configuration won't work in rainy season conditions. The response came immediately. None of our environmental consultants mentioned that. Peterson, our chief engineer, insists the valve design is flawless. What else? Sophie looked up from the document. Dad, this engineer, Senior Rodriguez, he's trying to tell them something important, but he's being very careful about how he says it. What do you mean? He keeps mentioning his grandmother. At first, I thought it was just nice stories, but he's talking about traditional water purification methods that indigenous people have used for centuries. He's trying to say that the new system should honor and incorporate those methods, not replace them. Robert stared at his daughter. How was she reading cultural subtleties that escape professional translators? There's more, Sophie continued. The timeline they keep discussing, 18 months. It's not just about engineering challenges. It's about getting approval from tribal leaders. That's why they can't rush it. Robert's phone rang. Catherine's name appeared on the cracked screen. Robert, I need to see you both in my office immediately. I just got off a call with our Brazilian partners, and something Sophie translated yesterday has changed everything. An hour later, they sat in Catherine's office while she paced behind her desk, her usual composure replaced by barely contained excitement. Your daughter's insight about the rainy season timeline was correct, Catherine said. But more importantly, she identified cultural concerns that could have killed the entire deal. Our American team was about to make a presentation that would have been seen as disrespectful to indigenous traditions. Sophie sat quietly, listening with the same focused attention she gave to everything. The Brazilians want to video conference with Sophie directly, Catherine continued. They're curious about this 8-year-old who understands their cultural nuances better than international consultants. Robert's protective instincts flared. I don't think, Dad, Sophie interrupted gently, if they want to talk to me, maybe I should listen. Sometimes people just want to know that someone else understands them. The solutions Sophie came up with would go on to change the lives of millions. Catherine pulled up a video call interface on her large monitor. Within moments, 3 men appeared on screen. The lead engineer, Rodriguez, and 2 colleagues sitting in what appeared to be a conference room with windows overlooking lush greenery. Hola, Sophie, Rodriguez said in heavily accented English. I hear you understand our concerns about the water project. Sophie smiled shyly. You're worried that the American engineers want to build something fast instead of something right. And you're worried they don't understand that water is sacred to your grandmother's people. Rodriguez's eyes widened. He spoke rapidly to his colleagues in Portuguese, then looked back at Sophie. You understood this from our technical documents? You love your grandmother very much, Sophie said simply. When people write about someone they love, their feelings show through their words, even in different languages. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, then smiled broadly. Sophie, would you be willing to help us explain our concerns to the American engineering team, not as a translator, but as someone who understands hearts as well as words? Robert watched his daughter consider this request with the gravity of someone much older. I think, Sophie said carefully, that everyone wants the water system to work and to help people. Maybe I can help everyone understand each other better. Catherine's phone started ringing with what Robert could see were multiple incoming calls. The deal just became much more complicated, Catherine murmured, but she was smiling. The conference room at Reynolds Water Solutions had been transformed into a war room. Charts covered the walls, laptops hummed on every surface, and coffee cups created rings on the mahogany table. Robert sat in the corner, feeling completely out of place among the engineers, lawyers, and executives who'd flown in from across the country. Sophie occupied the head of the table, a stack of translated documents before her, speaking with an authority that made grown men lean forward to catch every word. The Brazilian team isn't being difficult, she explained to the American engineers. They're trying to save us from making a mistake that would cost millions of dollars and hurt people who depend on clean water. James Peterson, the lead American engineer, frowned at his tablet. But their proposed timeline would delay implementation by over a year. People are dying from contaminated water while we debate cultural sensitivities. Robert recognized the type immediately, the kind of man who valued theory over practice, credentials over experience, the kind who would design a perfect system on paper that failed catastrophically in the field. Sophie's expression grew thoughtful. Senior Rodriguez lost his baby sister to bad water when he was 12. That's why he became an engineer. He's not trying to delay helping people. He's trying to make sure we help them the right way. The room fell silent. Catherine looked at the video conference screen where Rodriguez and his team waited. Rodriguez, Catherine said, Sophie says you lost your sister to contaminated water. Is that correct? Rodriguez nodded slowly. Maria, she was 3 years old. Our village had a water purification system installed by foreign contractors. It worked for 6 months, then failed during the rainy season. The contractors had already left, and we had no way to repair it. Peterson's frown deepened. We've accounted for seasonal variations in our design. Robert cleared his throat, drawing surprised looks from the executives. Have you accounted for maintenance training? Who fixes the system when it breaks? Because it will break. Everything does. Peterson's face flushed. Our systems are designed to minimize maintenance requirements. There's no such thing as a maintenance-free system, Robert said quietly. Not in the real world. I've seen too many million-dollar systems fail because no one could replace a $5 part. Sophie nodded, flipping through several pages of her translation notes. Senior Rodriguez keeps talking about his Uncle Carlos. He's not just an uncle. He's the person the village depends on when technology breaks. The Brazilians want Carlos and people like him to understand how the new system works before it's installed. That's part of the 18-month timeline, teaching local people to maintain it themselves. Catherine leaned forward. Rodriguez, is this correct? Sophie understands perfectly, Rodriguez replied. We need sustainable solutions, not just advanced technology. The extra time is for community integration and training. Robert watched his daughter facilitate a discussion between engineers who'd spent years in their respective fields. How was she bridging gaps that had stumped professionals? There's something else, Sophie said, looking directly at Peterson. You designed the system to process 10,000 gallons per day, but Senior Rodriguez's calculations show they need 15,000 gallons during dry season when neighboring villages share the water source. Peterson pulled up his engineering specs. Our demographic data showed peak usage at 8,000 gallons. Sophie shook her head. Senior Rodriguez says during drought, people walk for miles to reach clean water sources. The usage isn't just for the immediate community. Rodriguez nodded emphatically. Sophie is correct. During dry season, our facility serves 7 villages, not just one. Robert leaned forward, his mind already processing the problem. May I? He asked, gesturing toward Peterson's tablet. The engineer hesitated, then reluctantly handed it over. Robert studied the schematics for a moment, his fingers tracing the flow patterns with practiced ease. You could modularize the filtration system, he said, sketching quickly on a notepad. Build the infrastructure for full capacity from the start, but only install filtration modules as needed. That way you're not overbuilding initially, but you have the capacity to expand when necessary. I've done similar retrofits on industrial cooling systems. Peterson started to object, but Catherine silenced him with a look. Continue, Robert. You'd need to redesign the intake valve configuration and add parallel filtration paths. It's actually simpler than it sounds. We did something similar in Afghanistan when we had unexpected population increases at the base. Rodriguez studied Robert's rough sketch through the video feed. This could work. It would allow for gradual capacity increases without major reconstruction. Your father is as insightful as you are, Sophie. The American engineering team huddled around Robert's sketch, recalculating their projections. Catherine's phone buzzed with another call, but she ignored it, focused entirely on the discussion. If we increase capacity by 50% and extend the timeline for community training, Peterson said slowly, his professional pride wrestling with practical reality. We're looking at significant cost overruns, but also at a system that actually works long-term, Catherine replied. Sophie, what does Rodriguez think about cost concerns? Sophie consulted her notes. He says Brazilian labor costs are lower than American estimates, and local materials are more available than your suppliers indicated. The extra capacity might not cost as much as you think. Rodriguez smiled. Sophie reads not just our words, but our solutions. We have proposal for cost-effective modifications. Over the next 2 hours, Sophie helped negotiate a modified contract that addressed American timeline concerns while respecting Brazilian cultural requirements. Robert contributed practical mechanical insights that simplified the system design while making it more robust and maintainable. Catherine finally said, "Gentlemen, I think we have the framework for a successful partnership." As the video call ended and the engineering teams began detailed planning, Catherine approached Robert. "Your daughter just saved a $50 million deal and potentially thousands of lives. But more than that, she's shown us how to build something that will actually work." Robert looked at Sophie, who was quietly organizing her translation notes with the same methodical care she applied to everything. "She's always been special," he said softly. "I just never knew how special until now." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. If you're enjoying it, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. 3 weeks into the project, Sophie's medical symptoms began worsening. Robert found her collapsed in the bathroom at 3:00 a.m., disoriented and struggling to form coherent sentences, the terrifying episodes that signaled her condition's progression. By morning, she seemed normal again, but Robert knew they were running out of time. Catherine noticed immediately when they arrived at her office. Sophie's usual bright energy seemed dimmed, her responses slightly delayed. "Maybe we should postpone today's session," Catherine suggested gently. Sophie shook her head firmly. "The Brazilian team is waiting for my translation of the environmental impact section. Senior Rodriguez says it's the most important part." Robert watched his daughter force herself to concentrate on documents that would have challenged healthy adults. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, but her voice remained steady as she read. "They're worried about something they're not saying directly," Sophie said after reviewing several pages. "They keep mentioning future generations and irreversible consequences, but they're being very polite about it." Catherine leaned forward. "What kind of consequences?" Sophie traced her finger along a paragraph of Portuguese text. "There's a rare bird that only nests near the proposed water facility location. Senior Rodriguez's daughter, Isabella Pati, she's a biologist. She wrote this section. She's trying to say that if we disturb the nesting area, these birds might disappear forever." Robert felt a chill. Sophie's ability to read between cultural lines was remarkable, but extracting specific technical concerns from complex documents while battling neurological symptoms seemed impossible. "How can you be sure about the daughter?" Catherine asked. Sophie smiled weakly. "The writing style changes in this section. It's more scientific, but also more passionate. And look, she mentions her papa's wisdom about respecting nature. That's how daughters write about fathers they admire." Catherine's phone rang. Rodriguez's name appeared on the screen. "Senior Rodriguez," Catherine answered on speaker. "Sophie has been reviewing the environmental section." "Ah, yes, my daughter Isabella wrote that section. She is, how do you say, very concerned about the wildlife impact." Sophie straightened despite her fatigue. "Tell Isabella that we understand about the birds. Could the facility be moved 300 meters south? The water access would be the same, but the birds could keep their nesting area." There was silence on the call, then rapid Portuguese conversation in the background. "Isabella says 300 meters south would be perfect. She is amazed that someone understood her concerns so clearly." After the call ended, Catherine studied Sophie with growing concern. "Sweetheart, you look exhausted." "I'm okay," Sophie said, but her voice lacked conviction. Robert made a decision he'd been avoiding. Catherine, I need to be honest about Sophie's condition. She has episodes where she becomes disoriented. They're getting worse, and without treatment, he couldn't finish the sentence. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. How long do we have? The Swiss clinic says we need to begin treatment within 6 weeks, or the damage might be irreversible. Then we finish this project in 5 weeks, Catherine said firmly. I'm advancing you the medical treatment money immediately. Robert stared at her. But the contract says payment upon completion. The contract doesn't account for saving a little girl's life, Catherine interrupted. Besides, Sophie has already earned it. Her cultural insights have prevented 3 potential diplomatic disasters and identified cost-saving modifications worth $2 million. Sophie looked up from her documents. If I go to Switzerland for treatment, I won't be here to help with the final negotiations. Catherine knelt beside Sophie's chair. Sweetheart, the most important thing is making sure you get better. But Senior Rodriguez and his team are counting on me. And what about the people who need clean water? Robert felt his heart breaking. Even facing her own medical crisis, Sophie was worried about others. We'll figure it out, Catherine said softly. The Brazilian team understands that you're not well. They're grateful for everything you have already done. Sophie was quiet for several minutes, studying the contract pages spread before her. I want to finish, she said finally. I want to make sure the water system gets built right, so no more little sisters die like Senior Rodriguez's sister Maria. Robert looked at Catherine, seeing his own emotions reflected in her eyes. Admiration, worry, and a desperate hope that somehow they could save this extraordinary little girl who cared more about others than herself. We'll do whatever it takes, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. Outside the office windows, Portland's autumn rain began to fall, and Robert couldn't help but think about how water could be both life and death, both hope and heartbreak. The project was moving forward, but an unexpected obstacle was about to test Robert and Sophie in ways they couldn't imagine. Robert and Sophie were reviewing technical specifications for the water filtration system when Dr. Richard Montgomery entered Catherine's office unannounced. As Sophie's neurologist, he had been adamantly opposed to her involvement in the project from the beginning. Mr. Foster, he said, his voice stern, I need to speak with you, privately. Robert followed him into the hallway, steeling himself for what was coming. Your daughter's last brain scan shows accelerated deterioration in the temporal lobe, Dr. Montgomery said without preamble. Every hour she spends on this project is potentially shortening her functional timeline. Robert leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of those words. How much time do we have? Without immediate intervention? 6 months, maybe less, before significant communication impairment. I understand the financial situation, but Sophie needs rest in a stable environment, not corporate deadlines and pressure. Robert ran a hand through his hair. The treatment money is coming. Catherine has advanced it. And at what cost? Your daughter's condition? Before Robert could respond, the elevator doors opened and James Peterson stepped out, accompanied by a woman Robert hadn't met. Foster, Peterson called, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd never worked with his hands. I need to speak with you about these ridiculous modifications your daughter has been suggesting. Robert's jaw tightened. My daughter's modifications have saved your project from disaster. Your daughter is undermining my authority as chief engineer, Peterson snapped. These indigenous consultation periods she's insisting on will add months to the timeline. And now she wants us to relocate the entire facility because of some birds? The woman beside Peterson, sleek, blonde, wearing an expensive suit, stepped forward. I'm Elizabeth Chen, head of the Medical Technology Division. Mr. Foster, while your daughter's linguistic abilities are impressive, she lacks the technical expertise to make these kinds of engineering recommendations. Robert felt his patience fraying. My daughter understands what your experts have missed for 6 months, that this isn't just about building a water system. It's about building trust with the communities you're trying to help. Montgomery cleared his throat. This discussion is irrelevant. Sophie needs immediate medical attention, not corporate politics. Robert looked through the glass wall into Catherine's office, where Sophie was carefully explaining something to Rodriguez on the video screen. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alive with purpose. I don't know who raised this girl, Elizabeth Chen said, not unkindly. But she has remarkable empathy for someone so young. I raised her, Robert said quietly. After her mother died, it was just the two of us. And I taught her what my father taught me, that the measure of your work isn't how fancy it looks, but whether it's still running when you're gone. Peterson snorted. Garage philosophy doesn't apply to multi-million-dollar engineering projects. Actually, Robert replied, that's exactly where it matters most, because people's lives depend on it. Catherine stepped out of her office, having overheard the conversation. Peterson, your engineering team has made 3 critical errors that Sophie and Robert caught. Elizabeth, the Brazilian government is now considering expanding this project to potentially 50 locations across the country because of the cultural sensitivity Sophie has brought to the table. And Dr. Montgomery, I understand your medical concerns, but we're advancing the treatment funds immediately. She turned to Robert. There's a call you and Sophie need to take. The Brazilian Minister of Water Resources wants to speak with you both. Inside Catherine's office, Sophie was talking animatedly with a distinguished-looking man on the video screen. Robert recognized him immediately from news coverage. Gabriel Mendes, Brazil's recently appointed Minister of Water Resources. Ah, Mr. Foster, Mendes said when Robert entered. Your daughter has been explaining your modular filtration design. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We've been trying to solve this capacity problem for years. Robert stood awkwardly behind Sophie's chair. It's just a practical solution, sir, nothing fancy. Sometimes the best solutions aren't fancy, Mendes replied. They're just right. Now, I understand there's a personal situation affecting your timeline. Sophie looked up at her father, then back at the screen. I need to go to Switzerland for medical treatment, Minister Mendes, but I don't want to leave the project unfinished. Mendes's expression softened. Sophie, the work you've done has already transformed our approach. But I have a proposition. My technical team can come to Portland next week for intensive sessions to complete the cultural translations. And perhaps afterward, when you're feeling better, you might visit Brazil to see the system in operation? The hope in Sophie's eyes made Robert's heart ache. They both knew that when you're feeling better was an uncertain prospect at best. I would like that very much, Sophie said quietly. After the call ended, Catherine placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. The Swiss clinic confirmed they can take Sophie in 3 weeks. The funds have been transferred. Robert nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Dad, Sophie said, her voice small but determined. We have 3 weeks to finish this right. In that moment, looking at his daughter's resolve, Robert made a silent promise. Whatever happened, whatever it cost him, he would make these 3 weeks count. I hope you're still with us. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Sophie's condition continued to fluctuate. Some days she was sharp and focused. Others she struggled to remember what she'd translated the day before. Robert created a system at their apartment, color-coded notes, voice recordings, and a wall-sized timeline that helped Sophie track her progress even during her confused episodes. Catherine had arranged for Robert to take a leave of absence from the construction site with full pay. For the first time in years, he could focus entirely on Sophie without worrying about missing a shift. He used his mechanical skills to craft a special desk for Sophie that adjusted to her comfort level, with padding for her increasingly frequent headaches and a lighting system that reduced eye strain. One evening as they worked late at the kitchen table, Sophie looked up from her translations. Dad, I think I've found something important. Robert put down the pressure valve model he'd been tinkering with. What is it, sweetheart? In all of Senior Rodriguez's communications, he refers to the water system as O Guardião, the guardian, not as a machine or a facility. I think he sees this project as protecting his people, like you protect me. Robert studied his daughter's face, marveling at how she could see connections that eluded everyone else. What does that tell us about the project? It means the technical aspects matter, but what matters more is the promise behind them. The promise not to abandon the system or the people it serves. Sophie hesitated. Dad, can we make that promise? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that went beyond engineering specifications. Before Robert could answer, Sophie's hands began to tremble, the beginning of another neurological episode. I think that's enough for tonight, Robert said gently, helping Sophie from her chair. Time for rest. Later, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Robert sat alone on their small balcony, staring at the distant lights of downtown Portland. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Peterson is fighting the redesign, says it will impact his bonus metrics. I'm overriding him. How's Sophie? Robert typed back, good day today, bad tonight. It's getting harder for her to bounce back. Catherine's response came quickly. The Swiss clinic doctor called. Dr. Hoffman wants to move up Sophie's admission date. Says every day matters. Robert closed his eyes, feeling the weight of competing urgencies pressing down on him. The water project that would save countless lives. The treatment that might save his daughters. And somehow, impossibly, Sophie was trying to accomplish both. His phone buzzed again. Robert, there's something else. Dr. Hoffman mentioned a potential complication with the treatment. Can you come to the office early tomorrow? She wants to speak with both of us. The next morning, Catherine's office was unusually quiet. The war room charts had been pushed aside, and the large screen displayed the face of Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman from the Swiss Neurological Institute. Mr. Foster, Dr. Hoffman said, her accent lightly Germanic. I've been reviewing Sophie's latest scans and test results. While we're still confident in our ability to treat her condition, there's a complication you should be aware of. Robert gripped the arms of his chair. What kind of complication? Sophie's extraordinary linguistic and cultural processing abilities aren't just connected to her condition. They're dependent on the same neural pathways that are being damaged. If we proceed with the treatment protocol as planned, we expect to halt the neurological deterioration, but what? Robert prompted when she hesitated. But it's highly likely she will lose her enhanced language processing abilities. She'll develop normally from that point forward, but the unique way her brain currently interprets cultural and linguistic patterns will be normalized. The office fell silent as Robert absorbed this information. You're saying the treatment will cure her, but she'll lose her gift. Essentially, yes, Dr. Hoffman confirmed. The neural networks that currently allow her to process cultural nuances and emotional undertones with such sophistication will be restructured. She would still be highly intelligent, Mr. Foster, but not in the extraordinary way she is now. Catherine, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Is there an alternative? A way to treat her condition without affecting these abilities? We could potentially design a more conservative treatment approach, Dr. Hoffman said carefully. One that stabilizes her current condition without attempting to completely restructure the affected neural pathways. But it would be a temporary solution at best, buying her perhaps 3 to 5 years of stable function before the deterioration would inevitably continue. Robert felt as though the floor was dropping away beneath him. You're asking me to choose between giving my daughter a normal lifespan without her special abilities, or a few more years where she keeps this gift, but ultimately, he couldn't finish the sentence. This is not a decision to make immediately, Dr. Hoffman said gently, but it is one you should consider before we begin treatment. Sophie's condition is unique, and so must be our approach. After Dr. Hoffman's face disappeared from the screen, Robert sat motionless, staring at his calloused hands. Robert, Catherine said softly, this isn't a decision you have to make alone. How do I tell her? Robert whispered. How do I tell my 8-year-old daughter she has to choose between who she is and how long she lives? Before Catherine could answer, the office door opened, and Sophie walked in, her eyes clear and alert. One of her good days. Tell me what, Dad? She asked, and Robert realized she had overheard at least part of the conversation. Robert and Catherine exchanged a glance, and Catherine nodded slightly. Some truths couldn't be protected against, only faced together. Sweetheart, Robert began, his voice steadier than he felt. Dr. Hoffman has been looking at your test results, and there's something we need to discuss about your treatment. The story is about to take an unexpected turn. Stay with us to see how Sophie's condition would change everything. Robert knelt beside Sophie's chair, choosing his words carefully. The treatment in Switzerland can make you better, sweetheart. It can stop your condition from getting worse. Sophie's bright eyes studied her father's face. But it might change the way your brain works. The special way you understand languages and people's feelings. you might lose that ability. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information with the same intense focus she applied to her translations. So I would be normal? She finally asked. You would still be smart and wonderful, Robert assured her. Just different. The doctors could do another kind of treatment that would let you keep your special abilities for a while longer, but it wouldn't fix your condition permanently. How much longer? Sophie asked, her voice small but steady. Maybe 3 to 5 years, Catherine said gently. After that, your condition would start getting worse again. Sophie looked out the window at the Portland skyline, her expression unreadable. Can I think about it? Of course you can, Robert said, his heart breaking at watching his child face such an impossible choice. We still have the Brazilian project to finish, Sophie said, straightening her shoulders with determination that seemed too old for her 8 years. I need to complete my translations. Catherine opened her mouth as if to object, then closed it, recognizing the purpose burning in Sophie's eyes. The team is waiting in the conference room, she said instead. Senior Rodriguez has sent new technical specifications for the indigenous consultation phase. As they walked to the conference room, Robert's phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Montgomery. The Swiss clinic called me. Treatment needs to begin within 21 days for optimal results. No more delays. The war room had evolved over the past weeks. Sophie's color-coded notes covered one wall, while Robert's technical sketches and modifications dominated another. The engineering team had begrudgingly come to respect the practical solutions offered by the maintenance mechanic, especially after 3 of his design adjustments had reduced manufacturing costs by 15%. James Peterson stood at the head of the table, his posture stiff. We have a problem, he announced as they entered. The Brazilian Environmental Agency is requesting additional wildlife impact studies for the facility relocation. This could add months to the timeline. Sophie took her usual seat at the table, pulling out her notebook. It's not about wildlife studies, she said confidently. It's about Isabella's birds. Sophie, with all due respect, Peterson began, his tone making it clear he had little respect to offer. This is a complex regulatory matter, not a children's story about birds. Catherine held up her hand, silencing Peterson. Let her speak. Isabella's father, Senior Rodriguez, and the environmental minister are old friends, Sophie explained. They went to university together. When Isabella was little, her father used to take her birdwatching in the area where we want to build. The rare birds aren't just an environmental concern. They're a personal connection for the minister's family. Robert noticed how the other engineers in the room had learned to lean forward when Sophie spoke, despite Peterson's dismissive attitude. What do you suggest? Catherine asked. Sophie flipped through her notes. We need to show them we understand it's not just about following regulations. It's about respecting memories. She paused, thinking. What if we named the Water Purification Center after Isabella's favorite bird and created a small protected area around the facility specifically for birdwatching? The room fell silent as everyone considered this unexpectedly simple solution. That's actually brilliant, one of the junior engineers murmured. It addresses the emotional concern while actually enhancing our environmental commitment. Peterson scoffed. We're going to make major project decisions based on a child's guess about people's feelings? Robert felt his patience snap. My daughter's guesses have saved this project at least 4 times now. While you've been worried about your bonus metrics, she's been focused on making sure this system actually helps people. The room went silent. It was the first time Robert had directly confronted Peterson. Catherine cleared her throat. Peterson set up a call with the environmental ministry. Sophie, I'd like you to join that call to explain your idea personally. She glanced at Robert, a silent question in her eyes. Robert nodded slightly. Despite Dr. Montgomery's warnings, he couldn't deny Sophie this chance to finish what she'd started. The determination in her eyes told him that completing this project had become as important to her health as any medical treatment. After the meeting, Catherine pulled Robert aside. Peterson is a problem, she said quietly. He's been undermining the redesign efforts at every turn. He doesn't like having his authority questioned, Robert replied, especially by a maintenance mechanic and an 8-year-old girl. It's more than that, Catherine said. I found out he has a personal stake in the original design. His brother-in-law owns the company that manufactures the proprietary filtration components. Your modular design cuts their units by half. Robert's eyes narrowed. That's a conflict of interest. One I wasn't aware of until yesterday, Catherine confirmed. I've reassigned him to our Singapore project, effective next week. But in the meantime, watch your back. And Sophie's. I hope you're still with us. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. That evening, Robert drove Sophie home through Portland's persistent drizzle. The apartment they shared was small, but tidy. A two-bedroom unit in an older building with creaky pipes that Robert regularly fixed in exchange for reduced rent. It wasn't much, but with Charlotte gone and medical bills mounting, it was all they could afford. Sophie sat at the kitchen counter, stubbornly working through more translations, while Robert prepared a simple dinner of pasta and vegetables. He noticed how she massaged her temples periodically, a sign of the headaches that were becoming more frequent. You should rest, sweetheart, he said, placing a glass of water and her medication beside her notebook. Just a few more pages, Sophie insisted. I need to finish the section about community water distribution. There's something important about how they describe the shared access points that I can't quite grasp yet. Robert observed his daughter's furrowed brow and the determined set of her jaw, expressions that reminded him painfully of Charlotte. His late wife had shown that same stubborn focus during her battle with cancer, refusing to give up even when the odds were overwhelming. Your mother was just as determined as you are, he said softly. Sophie looked up, a small smile breaking through her concentration. That's what you always say, that I get my stubbornness from Mom and my mechanical sense from you. And it's true, Robert chuckled, stirring the pasta sauce. Remember how she insisted on finishing her mural at the children's hospital, even when she was too weak to stand? The nurses had to bring her a wheelchair and special brushes. I remember, Sophie said, her smile fading slightly. She said that finishing it was important because some things matter more than how you feel right now. The words hung in the air between them, taking on new meaning in light of Sophie's own situation. Robert turned back to the stove, blinking rapidly to clear his vision. After dinner, as Robert was washing dishes, his phone rang. Catherine's name flashed on the screen. Robert, I just got off a call with Minister Mendez, she said without preamble. He was impressed with Sophie's bird sanctuary proposal. He's personally approved the environmental variance. No additional studies required. That's great news, Robert replied, lowering his voice so Sophie wouldn't overhear from the living room where she was watching a Portuguese nature documentary, her way of relaxing while still improving her language skills. There's more, Catherine continued. The ministry has expanded the scope of the project. They want to implement similar water systems in 5 additional regions, potentially serving over 1 million people in total. Robert felt a surge of pride followed immediately by concern. That's incredible. But what does it mean for our timeline? Catherine was quiet for a moment. It means more work, more complexity. The Brazilian delegation wants to fly to Portland next week for intensive planning sessions. They specifically requested Sophie's involvement in the cultural framework development. Next week? Robert glanced toward the living room where he could see Sophie's small figure curled on the couch. Catherine, Dr. Montgomery is pushing hard for us to get to Switzerland as soon as possible. He says we're running out of time. I understand, Catherine said softly. But Robert, what Sophie is doing here, it's going to help millions of people. Clean water for communities that have never had reliable access. Fewer children dying from preventable diseases. Robert closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. I know, believe me, I know. But at what cost? Sophie is all I have left. If I lose her because we delayed treatment. What does Sophie want? Catherine asked gently. She hasn't said directly. But you've seen how determined she is to finish this project. Talk to her, Robert. Really talk to her. This has to be her decision too. After ending the call, Robert joined Sophie on the couch. The documentary was showing vibrant footage of the Amazon rainforest, with Portuguese narration that Sophie seemed to be following without difficulty. That was Catherine on the phone, he said. The Brazilian government loved your bird sanctuary idea, and they want to expand the project to 5 more regions. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? That means more people will get clean water. It does, Robert agreed, but it also means more work. The Brazilian team wants to come here next week for planning meetings. Sophie nodded excitedly, then winced as the movement triggered another headache. She tried to hide it, but Robert noticed. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about Switzerland," he said gently. "Dr. Montgomery thinks we shouldn't wait much longer to start your treatment." Sophie's expression grew serious. "But what about the project? If we leave now, who will help the Brazilian team understand the cultural nuances?" "Catherine and her translators would continue the work. They've learned a lot from you already." "But they'll miss things," Sophie said with certainty. "They'll miss the heart behind the words." Robert took his daughter's small hands in his. "Sophie, this project is important, but nothing is more important than your health. We can go to Switzerland, get you the treatment you need, and then maybe come back to help finish the project afterward." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to the rainforest images on the screen. "Dad, do you remember what Mom said when the doctors wanted her to try that really strong treatment? The one that might have given her a few more months?" Robert felt his chest tighten. Charlotte had opted for quality of life over quantity, choosing to spend her final months fully present with her family rather than extending her life in a diminished state. "I remember," he said softly. "She said she'd rather have less time being fully herself than more time as someone she didn't recognize. She wanted to finish her mural and spend time with us, not be sick in a hospital bed." Sophie looked up at her father, her blue eyes clear and determined. "I think I understand how she felt now." Robert felt a chill run through him. "Sophie, that was different. Your mom's condition was terminal. Yours isn't. The treatment can help you." "But at what cost?" Sophie asked, unconsciously echoing her father's earlier words to Catherine. "If I lose my ability to understand languages and people's feelings, I won't be me anymore." "Not really. You'll still be my amazing daughter," Robert insisted, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You'll still be smart and kind and wonderful. But I won't be able to help people the same way," Sophie countered. "And right now I'm helping a lot of people. People who need clean water." Robert struggled to find the right words, torn between his desperate desire to protect his daughter and his growing recognition of her wisdom beyond her years. "What if we talk to Dr. Hoffman about the modified treatment?" he suggested finally. "The one that would let you keep your abilities for a few more years? We could go to Switzerland after we finish the work with the Brazilian delegation." Sophie's face brightened. "Could we really do that? Could we finish the project first and then go?" "We'd need to talk to the doctors about the risks," Robert cautioned. "But if that's what you want, we'll find a way to make it work." Sophie threw her arms around her father's neck. "Thank you, Dad. I promise I'll work really hard to finish everything quickly." As Robert held his daughter close, he silently prayed he wasn't making a terrible mistake. Charlotte had been an adult making an informed choice about her own life. Sophie was just a child, a remarkable child, but still so young to face such momentous decisions. Yet as he felt Sophie's small body against his chest, her heart beating with such purpose and determination, he couldn't help but wonder if she understood something that he, in his protective father's role, had been missing. Perhaps her gift wasn't just about translating languages, but about seeing the bigger picture in a way that most adults had forgotten how to do. The next morning, they met with Dr. Montgomery at the hospital for Sophie's regular checkup. The neurologist was visibly displeased when Robert explained their decision to delay the trip to Switzerland until after the Brazilian delegation's visit. "Mr. Foster, I cannot emphasize strongly enough how critical timing is with this condition," Dr. Montgomery said, his voice tight with professional concern. "Every week we delay increases the risk of permanent neural pathway damage." "We understand the risks," Robert replied, "but we've decided to consult with Dr. Hoffman about the modified treatment approach, the one that would preserve Sophie's linguistic abilities." Dr. Montgomery shook his head. "That approach is experimental at best. It would stabilize her condition temporarily, but not address the underlying degeneration." "But it would let me keep helping people," Sophie interjected from the examination table where a nurse was checking her blood pressure. The doctor looked at her, his clinical detachment softening slightly. "Sophie, you're a remarkable young lady, but your health has to come first." "What if helping people is what makes me healthy?" Sophie challenged. "Not my brain, but my heart." Dr. Montgomery glanced at Robert with a raised eyebrow, clearly unused to being questioned by 8-year-old patients. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Mr. Foster." No, Robert said firmly. Sophie is part of this decision. She deserves to be included in the conversation. The neurologist sighed but nodded reluctantly. Very well. I'll arrange a video consultation with Dr. Hoffman to discuss the modified treatment protocol. But I want to be clear. Medically, I believe the standard treatment, begun as soon as possible, offers the best prognosis. We appreciate your opinion, doctor, Robert said. But this isn't just a medical decision. It's about Sophie's quality of life and the impact she wants to make with the time she has. As they left the hospital, Sophie took her father's hand. Dad, am I being selfish? Wanting to finish the project before getting treatment? Robert squeezed her small fingers. No, sweetheart. Selfish would be thinking only about yourself. You're thinking about all the people who will benefit from clean water. That's the opposite of selfish. I'm a little scared, Sophie admitted quietly, of the treatment, of losing my gift, of not being able to help people the same way anymore. She looked up at him, vulnerability plain on her face. What if helping with this project is the most important thing I'll ever do? Robert knelt on the sidewalk, bringing himself to her eye level. Sophie Foster, listen to me. This project is important, yes, but you have an entire lifetime ahead of you to do amazing things, with or without your current abilities. You'll find new ways to help people, new gifts to share. I promise you that. Sophie studied his face intently, as if searching for the truth behind his words. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but first, let's finish what we started. Deal, Robert agreed, standing and taking her hand again. Now let's go meet Catherine. The Brazilian team arrives tomorrow, and we have preparations to make. Behind at Reynolds Water Solutions, they found Catherine in her office, surrounded by maps and technical specifications for the expanded project. She looked up as they entered, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. How did it go with Dr. Montgomery? She asked. He's not happy about the delay, Robert admitted, but he's arranging a consultation with Dr. Hoffman to discuss the modified treatment approach. Catherine nodded, then turned to Sophie. And how are you feeling about all this, Sophie? I want to finish helping the Brazilian team, Sophie said resolutely. Then I'll go to Switzerland. Well then, Catherine said, a smile breaking through her professional demeanor. We'd better make sure every minute counts. The delegation arrives tomorrow morning. Rodriguez, Isabella, and 3 representatives from the indigenous communities, plus a technical team of 5 engineers. Robert whistled softly. That's a substantial group. The Brazilian government is taking this very seriously, Catherine confirmed. Minister Mendes has emphasized that the cultural integration framework Sophie has been developing is now considered as important as the technical specifications. Sophie beamed with pride, then moved to examine the maps spread across Catherine's desk. Are these the 5 new regions? Yes, Catherine confirmed, each with its own dialect, environmental considerations, and cultural nuances. Sophie traced the river systems with her finger. They all connect, she observed. The rivers, the communities, the water needs, they're all part of the same system. That's important. The Brazilian elders see water as a connector, not a resource. That's why they're so concerned about how we implement the purification systems. Robert watched his daughter analyze the complex geographical and cultural relationships with an intuitive understanding that no amount of academic training could provide. In these moments, her gift was so apparent, so valuable, that the idea of losing it to treatment seemed almost criminal. Yet the alternative, risking her long-term health for short-term impact, filled him with equal dread. As a father, his instinct was to protect her at all costs. As a parent who had already lost his wife to illness, the thought of delaying necessary medical care felt like tempting fate. Robert? Catherine's voice broke through his thoughts. The engineering team would like your input on the maintenance protocols for the expanded project. Your practical approach has been incredibly valuable. He nodded, grateful for the distraction from his worries. I'll work with them this afternoon, but first, I need to help Sophie prepare for tomorrow's meetings. Actually, Catherine said with a slight smile, Sophie has been invited to have lunch with Isabella. Rodriguez's daughter arrived early and specifically asked if Sophie could join her at the hotel restaurant. Sophie's face lit up. Really? Isabella wants to have lunch with me? She said she's bringing some recordings from the indigenous communities that she thought you might find interesting. Catherine confirmed. Robert hesitated. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Sophie needs to rest and… Dad, Sophie interrupted gently. I'll be fine. The hotel is just across the street, and I really want to meet Isabella. Robert recognized the determined set of his daughter's jaw, the same expression Charlotte had worn when she was set on something. All right, he conceded, but only for an hour, and I want you to call me if you start feeling tired. I promise, Sophie said solemnly, though her excited bounce betrayed her enthusiasm. As they made preparations for Sophie's lunch meeting, Robert couldn't help but marvel at how quickly his daughter had become not just a participant in this international project, but a central figure. People twice, 3 times, even 4 times her age were seeking her input, valuing her unique perspective. It was a bittersweet pride that filled him. Joy at seeing her extraordinary abilities recognized, fear at the cost those abilities might exact on her health. The clock was ticking, and each day brought them closer to a decision that would shape the rest of Sophie's life. The Brazilian delegation's arrival transformed the Reynolds Water Solutions offices. The sterile corporate environment blossomed with color and energy as Rodriguez and his team brought their vibrant culture into the heart of Portland's business district. Conference rooms were repurposed as collaborative workspaces, with Sophie's cultural translation notes prominently displayed alongside Robert's practical maintenance diagrams. Isabella Rodriguez, a passionate young biologist in her early 30s, had formed an immediate bond with Sophie during their lunch meeting. Now, 3 days into the delegation's visit, the two could often be found huddled together, with Isabella sharing her environmental expertise while Sophie translated the complex cultural considerations that embedded in the indigenous community's feedback. It's not just about preserving bird habitats, Isabella explained to the engineering team during a morning briefing. These birds are part of the community's identity, their stories, their understanding of the world. Sophie nodded eagerly. When Senior Rodriguez's technical team described the water flow rates, they used a phrase that translates literally as the river's breath. They're not being poetic, they're describing their scientific observation of seasonal variations through their cultural framework. Robert, who had been quietly adjusting a small-scale model of the filtration system, looked up with pride. Sophie's ability to bridge these worlds, technical and cultural, Western and indigenous, was remarkable. Yet each day he noticed small signs of her condition's progression. Moments of confusion, headaches that lasted longer, occasional tremors in her small hands. Hoffman had conducted 2 video consultations with them, carefully explaining the modified treatment approach that would preserve Sophie's unique neural pathways while stabilizing her condition. It's important to understand, the Swiss neurologist had emphasized, that this is not a cure. It's a compromise that buys time, perhaps 3 to 5 years of relatively stable function. After that, the degeneration will continue unless we intervene with the standard treatment protocol. Which would normalize her brain function, Robert had asked for clarification. Yes, Dr. Hoffman confirmed. The standard treatment would restructure the affected neural pathways, likely eliminating the unique processing patterns that give Sophie her extraordinary linguistic and cultural insights. Sophie, who had been listening intently to this discussion of her brain, spoke up with characteristic directness. But I would be healthy? I would live a normal lifespan? That is the expectation, yes, Dr. Hoffman replied, though of course there are no guarantees in medicine. Now, watching Sophie collaborate with Isabella on indigenous consultation protocols, Robert wondered if they were making the right choice. The modified treatment would preserve her gifts, but only temporarily. The standard treatment would give her a normal life, but take away what made her so special. It was an impossible dilemma, made more complex by Sophie's own fierce determination to complete the water project before beginning any treatment at all. Mr. Foster? One of the Brazilian engineers approached, interrupting Robert's troubled thoughts. We have a question about your modular filtration design. The components for the high-volume configuration, would they be accessible to local maintenance workers with limited tools? Robert pushed his worries aside, focusing on the practical problem at hand. That's actually a critical consideration, he said, moving to the technical diagrams. I've redesigned the access panels to use standard tools. And look here, these connection points are deliberately oversized to allow for maintenance with basic wrenches, not specialized equipment. The engineers studied the diagrams with new appreciation. This is very different from our usual approach. Typically, our systems require specialized training and tools, which means when they break down in remote locations, they stay broken, Robert observed. I learned that lesson the hard way in Afghanistan. The most advanced system in the world is useless if local people can't maintain it. Your practical experience is invaluable, the engineer acknowledged. Most of our consultants have never actually built or maintained the systems they design. Robert smiled ruefully. 20 years of fixing things teaches you how they break. That's a kind of knowledge you can't get from books or computer models. As the day progressed, Sophie showed increasing signs of fatigue. By mid-afternoon, Robert noticed her struggling to focus during a translation session with the indigenous representatives. When she stumbled over a Portuguese phrase she had translated flawlessly the day before, he intervened. "I think we need a break," he announced, gently guiding Sophie from her chair. "We'll continue this in an hour." Catherine, who had been observing from the doorway, followed them into the hallway. "Robert, is she all right?" "Just tired," Robert replied, though they both knew it was more than that. "She needs to rest." Catherine nodded, concern evident in her eyes. "Use my office. The couch is comfortable and it's quiet." As Sophie settled onto Catherine's office couch, Robert pulled the blinds closed to dim the harsh afternoon light. "Just rest for a little while, sweetheart. You've been working so hard." "But we need to finish the Indigenous consultation framework," Sophie protested weakly. "The elders are only here for 2 more days." "The framework can wait an hour," Robert insisted. "Your health comes first." Sophie sighed but didn't argue further. A sign of just how exhausted she truly was. Within minutes, she had drifted off to sleep, her small face finally peaceful. Robert watched her for a moment, then stepped outside where Catherine was waiting. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" Catherine asked quietly. "The good days are less frequent, the bad ones more severe," Robert confirmed. "Dr. Hoffman wants us in Switzerland next week at the latest." Catherine glanced through the doorway at Sophie's sleeping form. "Will you go with the modified treatment, the one that preserves her abilities?" "That's what Sophie wants," Robert said, his voice tight with emotion. "She's so determined to help with this project, to make a difference while she still can." "She reminds me of Charlotte," Catherine observed softly. Robert looked at her in surprise. "You never met my wife." "No, but I've heard Sophie talk about her, and I see her in Sophie. That same determination to finish what matters, regardless of personal cost." Catherine hesitated, then added, "It's a rare quality, one worth preserving, perhaps, even if only for a few more years." Before Robert could respond, Isabella approached, her expression worried. "Is Sophie all right? She seemed disoriented during our session." "She's resting," Robert explained. "The condition affects her energy levels and concentration." Isabella nodded thoughtfully. "My research focuses on biodiversity, but I've studied neurology as well. The brain's ability to adapt and compensate for damage is remarkable. Sometimes what appears to be dysfunction in one area creates unexpected strengths in others." "That's what seems to have happened with Sophie," Catherine confirmed. "Her condition has altered her neural pathways in ways that give her extraordinary linguistic and cultural processing abilities." "And the treatment would normalize these pathways?" Isabella asked. "The standard treatment, yes," Robert explained. "The modified approach would preserve them temporarily while stabilizing her condition." Isabella was quiet for a moment, considering this information. "In my field, we consider biodiversity essential to ecosystem health. Variation, even what might appear as abnormality, often serves a crucial purpose." She glanced toward Catherine's office where Sophie slept. "Perhaps the same is true of neurological diversity." The observation hung in the air between them, offering a perspective Robert hadn't considered before. What if Sophie's condition wasn't simply a medical problem to be fixed, but a different way of being in the world, one with its own unique value and purpose? The thought was interrupted by a commotion near the main conference room. Rodriguez emerged, his expression concerned, followed by several engineers speaking rapidly in Portuguese. "There is a problem," Rodriguez explained when he saw them. "The Environmental Ministry has received new hydrological data from the expanded project regions. The seasonal flow rates are much more variable than our models predicted." Catherine straightened immediately, shifting back into CEO mode. "How does this affect the implementation?" The current filtration system design would be overwhelmed during peak rainy season in at least 3 of the 5 new regions, one of the engineers explained. We need to completely recalculate the capacity requirements. Robert thought quickly. The modular design should be able to accommodate the variation. We just need to adjust the number of filtration units for each location based on maximum anticipated flow. It's more complicated than that, Rodriguez said grimly. The indigenous representatives are concerned that larger facilities would disrupt sacred sites near the river bends. They're threatening to withdraw their support entirely. Catherine ran a hand through her hair, a rare gesture of frustration breaking through her professional composure. This could set us back months. The entire project expansion could be at risk. Sophie would know how to approach this, Isabella said quietly. She understands the cultural significance of the river sites in a way none of us do. Robert glanced toward Catherine's office, where his daughter still slept, exhausted from the morning's efforts. She needs rest, he said firmly. This will have to wait until she's stronger. Of course, Rodriguez agreed immediately. Sophie's health must come first. Perhaps we can review the hydrological data in the meantime and prepare options for her to consider when she wakes. As the group moved toward the engineering workspace, Isabella lingered behind with Robert. Your daughter is extraordinary, she said softly. In my culture, we would say she has a gift from the river spirits, the ability to flow between worlds, carrying meaning from one to another. Robert smiled faintly. In my culture, we call it a neurological condition and try to fix it. Isabella's answering smile was sad but understanding. Different perspectives, neither entirely wrong. The challenge is finding the balance between them, just as Sophie does so beautifully between languages and cultures. The conversation left Robert thoughtful as he returned to Catherine's office to check on Sophie. She was still sleeping, but her face was no longer peaceful. Her brow was furrowed, and she mumbled occasionally, signs of the neurological activity that both blessed and cursed her. Watching his daughter, Robert was struck anew by the impossible choice they faced. The standard treatment would give Sophie a normal life, going to school, making friends, growing up healthy, but would take away the extraordinary gift that made her who she was. The modified treatment would preserve that gift, but only for a few precarious years before the inevitable decline continued. What was the right answer? What would Charlotte have advised if she were here? His late wife had always had a clarity about such matters that Robert sometimes lacked. She had seen the big picture, the long view, while he tended to focus on what was directly in front of him, the problem that needed fixing today. Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Dad? She murmured, disoriented. I'm here, sweetheart. Robert moved to sit beside him. How are you feeling? My head hurts, Sophie admitted, and I had strange dreams about rivers and birds talking to each other. Robert smiled, brushing the hair from her forehead. That's not so strange, considering what you've been working on. Sophie sat up slowly, looking around Catherine's office as if to orient herself. Did I miss anything important? Robert hesitated, torn between honesty and protection. There's been a development with the project expansion, he said finally. Something about hydrological data and sacred sites, but it can wait until you're feeling stronger. No, Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. I want to help now. Where's Isabella? And Senor Rodriguez? Sophie, Robert began gently, you need to pace yourself. You can't solve every problem all at once. His daughter's blue eyes met his, clear and determined despite the pain he knew she was feeling. Dad, do you remember what you always say about fixing engines? That you have to understand the whole system to fix any part of it. Robert nodded, surprised by the reference. That's what this is like, Sophie continued. The rivers, the communities, the sacred sites. They're all connected. You can't fix one part without understanding the whole system. And right now, I understand that system better than anyone else. There was no arguing with her logic, or with the passion behind it. Robert recognized that same fire that had driven Charlotte to finish her hospital mural, even as cancer drained her strength. The need to complete something meaningful, to leave a mark on the world that would outlast one's own presence in it. All right, he conceded, but we take it slow, and you tell me immediately if you start feeling worse. Sophie nodded solemnly. I promise. Now, can you help me find Isabella? I want to ask her about the river spirits her people believe in. I think that might be the key to understanding the sacred sites issue. As they left Catherine's office, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching his daughter race against time, pouring every ounce of her fading strength into a project that mattered more to her than her own health. It was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. This child with an old soul who understood something about purpose and meaning that many adults never grasped. The Brazilian delegation's workspace was humming with activity when they arrived. Engineers clustered around maps and data tables, while the indigenous representatives spoke animatedly with Rodriguez and Catherine. Isabella stood slightly apart, studying satellite images of river systems with a furrowed brow. She looked up as Sophie approached, her expression brightening. "Sophie, are you feeling better?" "A little," Sophie said, not entirely truthfully. "Dad says there's a problem with sacred sites in the expanded project?" Isabella nodded, leading Sophie to the satellite images. "The hydrological data shows we need larger facilities in 3 of the new regions, but the optimal locations all intersect with sites the indigenous communities consider sacred, places where they believe the river spirits dwell." Sophie studied the maps intently. "Can you show me where exactly?" Isabella pointed to several river bends marked in red. "These locations have the best water access and elevation for efficient filtration, but they're all at what the elders call singing bends, places where the river's sound changes in a particular way that they associate with spiritual presence." Sophie was quiet for a moment, her head tilted slightly as she processed this information. Then she asked, "Have you recorded the sound of the river at these bends?" Isabella blinked in surprise. "No, but that's an interesting question. Why?" "Because it's not about the location itself," Sophie explained, her voice growing excited despite her fatigue. "It's about the sound. The elders talk about the river spirits singing. What if the sound is what's sacred, not the physical spot?" The insight hung in the air for a moment as Isabella considered its implications. "You think we could build elsewhere as long as we preserve the sound?" "Or incorporated it somehow," Sophie suggested. "What if the water flowing through the filtration system could be designed to create a similar sound? Then the spirit's song would continue, just in a new form." Isabella's eyes widened. "Sophie, that's brilliant, and entirely consistent with their belief system. The river spirits aren't bound to one location. They flow with the water itself." She quickly called over Rodriguez and one of the indigenous representatives, explaining Sophie's insight in rapid Portuguese. The elder's face, initially skeptical, gradually transformed as he understood the proposal. "He says it might be possible," Isabella translated for Sophie and Robert. "They would need to hear the sound of the water passing through the filtration system to be sure the spirits' voices were preserved. We could modify the outflow chamber to create specific acoustic properties," Robert suggested, his mechanical mind already working on the problem. "It wouldn't be difficult, just a matter of designing the right resonance chambers and flow patterns." Catherine, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, turned to her engineering team. "Can we create a sound simulation based on the filtration system design? Something the elders could listen to before we finalize the locations?" "Absolutely," one of the acoustic engineers confirmed. "We'd need recordings of the original river sounds for comparison, but the technology exists." And the solution had materialized in minutes, a perfect integration of technical feasibility, cultural sensitivity, and innovative thinking. And at the center of it all was Sophie, whose unique ability to understand both the spoken and unspoken aspects of the indigenous concerns had identified a path forward that no one else had seen. As the team mobilized to implement the new approach, Robert noticed Sophie swaying slightly where she stood. He moved quickly to her side, supporting her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I think that's enough for today," he said quietly. "You've given them what they need to move forward." Sophie didn't protest, a testament to how truly exhausted she was. As Robert guided her toward the door, Isabella approached with a small wooden carving of a bird. "This is for you," she said, pressing it into Sophie's hands. "It's the rare ibis we're protecting with the sanctuary. My father carved it for you as a thank you for understanding what was in our hearts." Sophie clutched the carving to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you. It's beautiful." As they drove home through the evening traffic, Sophie held the wooden bird in her lap, running her fingers over its smooth contours. "Dad," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about the treatment options." Robert glanced at her, his heart rate quickening. "Oh?" "I want the modified treatment," Sophie said decisively, "the one that lets me keep my abilities for a while longer." Though he'd suspected this was her preference, hearing her state it so clearly still sent a wave of complex emotions through Robert. Relief that she'd made a decision, fear for what it might mean for her future, pride in her courage to choose her own path. "Are you sure, sweetheart? The standard treatment would give you a better chance at a normal, healthy life." Sophie looked out the window at the passing city lights. "But it wouldn't be my life, Dad. Not really. It would be someone else's. Someone who looks like me but doesn't see the world the way I do. Doesn't understand what I understand." Robert swallowed hard. 3 to 5 years isn't very long, Sophie. "It's long enough to finish this project and maybe help with others," Sophie replied with surprising practicality. "And after that, when my abilities start to fade, we can try the standard treatment. By then, maybe the doctors will have found a way to fix me without changing who I am." The hope in her voice was almost unbearable. The child's optimism that science would find a way, that the impossible choice might somehow resolve itself if they just bought enough time. Robert couldn't bring himself to crush that hope, even knowing how slim the chances were. "All right," he said finally. "We'll tell Dr. Hoffman that's what we want. And we'll schedule the treatment for after the Brazilian delegation leaves, in about 2 weeks." "Thank you, Dad," Sophie said, leaning against his arm. "For understanding, for letting me be me for as long as I can." The words echoed in Robert's mind long after Sophie had fallen asleep that night. "For letting me be me for as long as I can." Wasn't that what everyone wanted in the end? The freedom to be fully themselves, to use their unique gifts, to make their mark on the world in their own way? As he sat on their small balcony looking out at the Portland skyline, Robert wondered if he was making the right choice as a parent. The conventional wisdom would say no, that his job was to protect Sophie's health above all else, to choose the treatment with the best long-term prognosis regardless of other considerations. But Sophie wasn't a conventional child, and her condition wasn't a conventional medical problem. The very neural pathways that were deteriorating had given her extraordinary abilities that were helping thousands, potentially millions of people access clean water. Was it selfish of him to support her choice? Or would it have been more selfish to deny her the chance to complete the work that gave her such purpose and meaning? Robert had no answers, only questions that circled endlessly in his mind as the night deepened around him. Whatever path they took, there would be both gain and loss. The only certainty was that time was precious, and growing more so with each passing day. The next morning brought new energy to the project. Word of Sophie's innovative solution to the sacred sites issue had spread throughout the Brazilian delegation, elevating her already considerable status among the team. The indigenous representatives, initially skeptical of the American company's intentions, now looked to the 8-year-old girl as their most trusted advocate. While the engineering team worked on the acoustic modifications to the filtration system, Sophie and Isabella focused on completing the cultural integration framework, the comprehensive document that would guide all aspects of the project's implementation in indigenous territories. "The framework needs to emphasize reciprocity," Sophie explained to the documentation team. "The communities don't see this as us giving them clean water. They see it as a partnership where they're sharing their water resources and cultural knowledge with us, and we're sharing our technical expertise with them." Robert, who had been invited to join the senior engineering meetings based on his practical contributions, found himself unexpectedly recognized as an authority figure. His years of hands-on experience with water systems in challenging environments had proven more valuable than the theoretical knowledge of many highly credentialed consultants. "The key is simplicity," he emphasized during a discussion of maintenance protocols. "Every component that can break should be replaceable with locally available parts or tools. Every maintenance procedure should be teachable to someone with basic mechanical skills." Catherine, observing these developments with quiet satisfaction, pulled Robert aside during a break. "You've become quite the project leader," she remarked. "The engineers actually listen to you now." Robert chuckled. "Amazing what 20 years of fixing broken systems will do for your credibility." "It's more than that," Catherine insisted. You have a way of cutting through the theoretical to what actually matters on the ground. It's a perspective we've been missing. She hesitated, then added, I'd like to offer you a position at Reynolds Water Solutions as our Director of Field Implementation and Training. Your experience would be invaluable as we expand our global water projects. Robert stared at her in surprise. You're offering me a job as a director? With appropriate compensation, of course, Catherine continued. Enough to cover Sophie's ongoing medical care and to provide stability for your future, whatever treatment path you choose. The offer was unexpected and extraordinarily generous. Robert's mind raced with the implications: financial security for himself and Sophie, meaningful work that utilized his practical skills, the chance to influence how water systems were designed and implemented around the world. I don't know what to say, he admitted. My focus has been so completely on Sophie and her treatment. I haven't thought beyond that. You don't need to decide now, Catherine assured him. The offer will remain open, just something to consider as you plan for the future. As Robert returned to the engineering meeting, his thoughts were turbulent. A future. Catherine had spoken of it so casually, as if it were a certainty. Yet with Sophie's condition and their decision to pursue the modified treatment, the future felt more precarious than ever. 3 to 5 years of stability, the doctors had said. And then what? The inevitable progression of the condition, or a transition to the standard treatment that would preserve Sophie's health but fundamentally change who she was. These questions haunted him even as he continued his work with the engineering team, offering practical insights on field implementation challenges. By the end of the day, the team had developed a comprehensive maintenance and training program that would empower local communities to sustain the water systems independently, exactly the outcome Robert had advocated for. When he went to collect Sophie from her work with Isabella, he found her in animated conversation with one of the indigenous elders. The man was speaking in his native dialect, not Portuguese, yet Sophie seemed to be following along, occasionally responding with simple phrases that made the elder smile and nod. She has a gift for languages, Isabella observed, coming to stand beside Robert. But it's more than that. She genuinely cares about understanding people, not just their words, but their hearts. She gets that from her mother, Robert said softly. Charlotte could always read people, sense what they were really feeling beneath the surface. Isabella studied him thoughtfully. And what about you, Mr. Foster? What gifts did Sophie inherit from her father? Robert considered the question. Stubbornness, probably, and maybe a certain practicality, the need to understand how things work, how to fix them when they break. Those are valuable traits, Isabella noted, especially when balanced with empathy and insight. Perhaps that's why Sophie is so extraordinary. She embodies the best of both her parents. The observation warmed something in Robert's chest. He had always seen Charlotte in Sophie, in her compassion, her intuitive understanding of others. But perhaps there was something of himself there too, something worth preserving alongside her mother's legacy. As they prepared to leave for the day, Catherine approached with news. The acoustic engineers have created a sound simulation for the modified filtration system. The indigenous representatives would like Sophie to be present when they evaluate it tomorrow. Of course, Sophie agreed immediately, though Robert could see the fatigue in her eyes after a long day of translations and cultural consultations. Sophie needs rest, he reminded everyone gently but firmly. We'll be here in the morning, but not too early. That night, as Robert prepared a simple dinner in their apartment kitchen, his phone rang. Dr. Hoffman's name appeared on the screen, and he felt a flutter of anxiety as he answered. Mr. Foster, the Swiss neurologist greeted him. I've received your decision regarding the modified treatment protocol. I wanted to discuss the timeline with you directly. We're planning to come to Switzerland after the Brazilian delegation leaves, Robert explained. In about 10 days. There was a pause on the line. Mr. Foster, I've been reviewing Sophie's most recent scan results. The progression is accelerating faster than we anticipated. I would strongly recommend beginning treatment within the next week. Robert felt his chest tighten. That soon? But the project... I understand the project is important, Dr. Hoffman interrupted gently. But Sophie's condition doesn't operate on our preferred schedule. Each day increases the risk of permanent neural pathway damage that even our treatments cannot reverse. What exactly are you saying? Robert asked. his voice dropping to ensure Sophie wouldn't overhear from the living room. I'm saying that if you delay much longer, even the modified treatment may not be effective in preserving her linguistic abilities. There's a window of opportunity here, and it's closing rapidly. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He had been operating under the assumption that they had time, not abundant time, but enough to complete the project properly before seeking treatment. Now, that assumption was being challenged by the medical reality of Sophie's deteriorating condition. I'll talk to Sophie, he said finally, and to Catherine. We'll see if we can accelerate the remaining work. I understand this is difficult, Dr. Hoffman said sympathetically. But as her physician, I must emphasize that Sophie's neurological health needs to be the priority now. Whatever you decide, please let us know so we can make the necessary arrangements. After ending the call, Robert stood motionless in the kitchen, the weight of this new information pressing down on him. The timeline was collapsing. The careful balance they had been trying to maintain between completing the project and seeking treatment was becoming unsustainable. Dad? Sophie's voice came from the doorway. Who was on the phone? Robert turned to find his daughter watching him with those perceptive blue eyes that seemed to see right through him. There was no point in hiding the truth. She would sense it anyway. That was Dr. Hoffman, he admitted. She's concerned about the timing of your treatment. She thinks we should go to Switzerland sooner than we planned. Sophie absorbed this information with remarkable composure. How much sooner? Within the next week, Robert said gently. She's worried that if we wait much longer, even the modified treatment might not be able to preserve your abilities. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this new reality. But we haven't finished the cultural framework yet, she said finally, and the indigenous representatives are counting on me to help explain the acoustic modifications tomorrow. I know, sweetheart. Robert knelt to her level, taking her small hands in his. We'll figure it out. Maybe we can accelerate the remaining work, focus on the most critical elements before we have to leave. Sophie nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed. What if I teach Isabella and Catherine how to understand the cultural nuances, like a crash course in heart reading? Robert smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Heart reading? That's what Isabella calls it, Sophie explained. She says I don't just translate languages, I translate hearts. Maybe I can teach them how to do it too, at least a little bit. The idea was so characteristically Sophie, practical yet optimistic, focused on solutions rather than limitations. Even facing a compressed timeline for her treatment, her primary concern was ensuring the project's success, the community's well-being. That's a wonderful idea, Robert agreed. We'll talk to Catherine tomorrow about how to make it happen. As they sat down to dinner, Sophie was unusually quiet, pushing food around her plate more than eating it. Finally, she looked up at her father with an expression that seemed too mature for her young face. Dad, I've been thinking about something, she said carefully, about the treatment and what happens after. Robert set down his fork, giving her his full attention. What about it, sweetheart? If the modified treatment only gives me a few years before my condition gets worse again, what happens then? Do I get the standard treatment that makes me normal? The question hung in the air between them, the long-term question that Robert had been avoiding in favor of the immediate challenges. That would be one option, he said carefully. Or by then, the doctors might have developed new treatments that could help without changing who you are. Sophie nodded, considering this. But if they haven't, and I have to get the standard treatment eventually, why am I choosing the modified one now? Why not just get the standard treatment right away and be healthy? The question cut to the heart of their dilemma, articulated with a clarity that belied Sophie's 8 years. Robert struggled to find the right words to explain a choice that was as much emotional as it was rational. Because right now, you have a chance to finish something important, he said finally, to use your special abilities to help people in a way that no one else can. The modified treatment gives you time to do that, to leave your mark on the world as the Sophie you are now. And then afterward, I'll be a different Sophie, she said quietly. One who can't understand hearts the same way. You'll still be you, Robert insisted. Different in some ways, yes, but still my amazing, kind, brilliant daughter. Still Sophie Foster. She seemed to consider this, her small face solemn in the soft kitchen light. I think I understand, she said finally. It's like when you restore old cars. Sometimes you have to replace parts to keep the car running, even if it changes how the car works a little bit. The comparison, so practical, so mechanical, so like the way Robert himself thought about problems, brought a lump to his throat. That's right, sweetheart. Sometimes we have to make changes to keep going. It doesn't mean the car isn't still special, still valuable. Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Okay, then let's finish our work with the Brazilian team as fast as we can, and then go to Switzerland. I want to make sure the water keeps flowing for a long, long time, even after I change. Robert reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand, marveling at her wisdom and courage. That's exactly what we'll do. The story of Sophie's accelerated treatment timeline spread quickly through the project team the next morning. Rather than causing delays or complications, it galvanized everyone into focused, efficient action. The Brazilian delegation, led by Rodriguez, reorganized their work plan to prioritize the elements that most needed Sophie's unique insights. The engineering team accelerated their technical documentation, with Robert working alongside them to ensure practical implementation details weren't overlooked. Catherine cleared her schedule completely, working directly with Sophie on what they now called the Cultural Translation Crash Course, an intensive effort to document Sophie's methods for identifying and interpreting the subtle cultural nuances embedded in the Brazilian communications. It's not just about the words, Sophie explained as they created a comprehensive guide. It's about the patterns, when they mention family members or natural elements or traditional practices. Those references almost always signal something important they're trying to communicate indirectly. The solutions Sophie came up with would go on to change the lives of millions. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Catherine's office as Sophie carefully arranged her translation notes and cultural observation cards on the large conference table. Today was crucial, their last full day with the Brazilian delegation before the flight to Switzerland tomorrow evening. Hoffman had made the arrangements, emphasizing that further delays would risk the effectiveness of even the modified treatment protocol. "Are you ready for this?" Robert had asked, watching his daughter organize her materials with methodical precision. "Almost," Sophie replied, her small face set with determination. "This has to work, Dad. They need to understand the heart behind the words, not just the words themselves." Over the past 3 days, Sophie had been working tirelessly to create what she called her Cultural Bridge Manual, a comprehensive guide to interpreting the subtle nuances lost in Brazilian technical communications. What had begun as simple translation notes had evolved into an innovative methodology for cross-cultural understanding. Catherine entered the office, followed by Isabella, Rodriguez, and 2 representatives from the indigenous communities. "Everyone's ready when you are, Sophie," Catherine said gently. Sophie took a deep breath and nodded. "I think the best way to start is with a demonstration. Could you play the recording from last week's technical meeting? The one where Senior Rodriguez was explaining the seasonal water flow patterns." As the recording played, Sophie walked the group through her analysis, pointing out specific phrases and patterns. "Notice how he mentions his grandmother 3 times when discussing the high water season? That's not reminiscing. It's a cultural reference to traditional knowledge about flood predictions. When Brazilian engineers mention family members in technical discussions, they're usually signaling the importance of generational wisdom." Isabella's eyes widened. "That's exactly right. But how did you recognize this pattern?" "I noticed it repeated across different engineers and different topics," Sophie explained. "It's consistent. They invoke family when incorporating traditional knowledge, natural elements when expressing environmental concerns, and community activities when addressing social impact." For the next 2 hours, Sophie led what amounted to a masterclass in cultural interpretation. She had organized her observations into recognizable patterns, created visual guides to emotional undertones in technical language, and even developed a simple coding system for identifying unspoken concerns in formal documents. "This is extraordinary," Rodriguez murmured, studying the pattern recognition charts Sophie had created. "You've systematized something we do intuitively, but have never been able to explain to our international partners." The key is looking for what's consistent but indirect, Sophie explained. Like how your team always mentions rainfall patterns when you're actually concerned about implementation timelines being too aggressive. The rain is real, but it's also a metaphor for slow down and respect natural rhythms. As the morning progressed, Robert watched with a mixture of pride and amazement as his 8-year-old daughter effectively trained professionals with decades of experience. Her methods were intuitive yet systematic, blending pattern recognition with emotional intelligence in a way that made the invisible visible. By lunchtime, Catherine had arranged for professional documentation specialists to record and formalize Sophie's methodology. This isn't just a project tool, she explained to Robert quietly. This is potentially a new approach to international development communication, something that could transform how we work across cultures. Robert nodded, too moved to speak. In creating this framework, Sophie had ensured that her gift would continue benefiting others even after she could no longer apply it herself. It was exactly what Charlotte would have done, finding a way to leave a lasting legacy despite limited time. After a brief lunch break, the focus shifted to the acoustic modifications for the sacred river sites. The engineering team had prepared sound simulations based on Sophie's insight that the indigenous communities were concerned with preserving the river's voices rather than specific locations. We've modeled how water would flow through the modified filtration system, the lead acoustic engineer explained, setting up audio equipment. These recordings simulate the sound at various flow rates and configurations. The indigenous elders listened intently as the recordings played, their expressions inscrutable. Sophie watched them closely, noting minute changes in their posture and eye movements. When the final simulation ended, she leaned over to whisper something to the eldest representative. The man's eyes widened in surprise, then he smiled and nodded, speaking rapidly in his native dialect. Sophie responded with a few halting words in the same language, then turned to the group. He says the third configuration preserves what they call the river's breath, the particular resonance that signifies the water spirit's presence. But he was surprised that I could hear it too. Isabella translated the elder's next words. He says Sophie has the ears of the ancestors. She can hear what most outsiders cannot. Catherine looked at the acoustic engineer. Can we implement the third configuration at all project sites? Absolutely, the engineer confirmed. It actually simplifies the outflow chamber design compared to our original specifications. As the technical teams began incorporating this solution into the final plans, Robert noticed Sophie swaying slightly where she stood. He moved quickly to her side, supporting her with a gentle hand. I think you need a break, sweetheart, he said quietly. To his surprise, Sophie nodded without protest. Just for a little while. I want to be back for the final framework review this afternoon. The fact that she agreed so readily concerned Robert more than any obvious symptom. He guided her to the small sofa in Catherine's office, where she curled up with her notebook still clutched in her hands. Just rest, Sophie. You've accomplished so much already today. She nodded sleepily, her eyes already drifting closed. Dad, do you think we'll finish everything before we have to leave? We're going to try, Robert promised, and what we don't finish, others will continue based on your framework. As Sophie fell asleep, Robert stepped outside to find Catherine waiting in the hallway. She's pushing herself too hard, Catherine observed quietly. I know, but there's no stopping her. She's determined to complete as much as possible before... Robert couldn't finish the sentence, the reality of tomorrow's departure hanging heavily between them. The engineers have been implementing her acoustic solution for the sacred sites, Catherine said. It's elegant, cost-effective, and culturally sensitive. A perfect integration of technical and cultural considerations. Your daughter sees connections that the rest of us miss entirely. Robert smiled faintly. She's always been that way. Even before her condition progressed, she made connections that surprised us. Charlotte used to say Sophie didn't just hear words, she heard the music behind them. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Have you considered my job offer? Director of Field Implementation and Training? Honestly, I haven't had time to think about anything beyond getting Sophie to Switzerland, Robert admitted. The offer stands, Catherine assured him, no matter what happens with Sophie's treatment or condition. Reynolds Water Solutions needs your practical expertise and... She hesitated, then continued, I think you might need a purpose beyond being Sophie's father, especially in the challenging times ahead. The observation was unexpectedly perceptive, touching on fears Robert had barely acknowledged to himself. What would his role be if Sophie lost her special abilities? If she became, as she had put it, a different Sophie? For so long, his identity had been wrapped up in supporting and protecting his extraordinary daughter. What would remain if that extraordinariness faded? Before he could respond, Isabella approached from the conference room, her expression urgent. Robert, Catherine, the Minister of Water Resources is on video conference. He wants to speak with Sophie about the expanded project framework. She's resting, Robert replied immediately. She's exhausted and needs to conserve her strength. Of course, Isabella nodded. But he specifically mentioned having news about a research initiative related to her condition. Something about neurological diversity in Brazil? Robert and Catherine exchanged a puzzled glance. What kind of research initiative? Catherine asked. He didn't elaborate, but he seemed quite excited about it. He said it might be relevant to Sophie's treatment options. Robert hesitated, torn between protecting his daughter's limited energy and pursuing any potential help for her condition. Let me see if she's awake. If she's still sleeping, the minister will have to wait. When he checked on Sophie, he found her already sitting up, her notebook open as she reviewed her notes. I heard Isabella, she said before Robert could speak. Minister Mendez wants to talk to me. You don't have to do this now, Robert insisted. You need to rest. I'm okay, Dad, Sophie said, though the shadows beneath her eyes suggested otherwise. And if it's about research that could help my condition, we should hear what he has to say. In the conference room, Minister Mendez's face appeared on the large screen, his expression brightening when he saw Sophie. Ah, there she is, our young cultural bridge builder. How are you feeling, Sophie? I'm fine, thank you, Sophie replied politely. Isabella mentioned you have news about neurological research. The minister nodded, his manner becoming more formal. Indeed, after learning about your condition and your remarkable linguistic abilities, I consulted with our Ministry of Health and several research institutions in Brazil. We have a neurological research center in Sao Paulo that specializes in atypical neural development, particularly cases where neurological conditions create unusual cognitive advantages. Robert leaned forward, his interest piqued. What kind of research do they do? They study what they call cognitive divergence, brain development that differs from the typical pattern but produces special abilities or insights. Their focus is on preserving these unique neural pathways while addressing the medical challenges they sometimes present. Sophie's eyes widened. That sounds like exactly what we're looking for. Minister Mendez continued, the research director, Dr. Camila Santos, has expressed specific interest in your case. She believes your ability to process cultural and linguistic patterns may represent a form of cognitive divergence that could inform their work on alternative treatment approaches. Alternative treatment approaches? Robert repeated, hardly daring to hope. Beyond what the Swiss clinic has offered? Dr. Santos and her team are pioneering treatments that target specific neural pathways rather than broader regions of the brain. Their goal is to stabilize degenerative conditions while preserving unique cognitive functions. The minister paused. I'm not a medical expert, so I cannot speak to the specifics or make promises. But Dr. Santos would very much like to consult on Sophie's case, if you're open to it. Catherine, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Minister Mendez, this sounds promising, but Sophie is scheduled to begin treatment in Switzerland tomorrow. The doctors there have emphasized that further delays could be risky. Of course, and I would never suggest delaying necessary medical care, Mendez assured them. Dr. Santos has offered to arrange a video consultation today, if possible. She could review Sophie's records and discuss potential collaboration with the Swiss medical team. Robert looked at Sophie, who was practically vibrating with hope. It can't hurt to talk to her, right, Dad? Maybe she knows something that could help with the modified treatment. I'll need to speak with Dr. Hoffman in Switzerland first, Robert said cautiously, unwilling to raise false hope but equally unwilling to dismiss a potential opportunity. But yes, we can certainly arrange a consultation. As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for the video call with Dr. Santos, Robert pulled Catherine aside. What do you think about this? Is it real or just giving Sophie false hope? Catherine considered the question carefully. Brazil has invested significantly in neurological research over the past decade, particularly in Sao Paulo. and Mendez wouldn't risk his professional reputation on questionable science. She paused. I think it's worth exploring, but with realistic expectations. This won't be a miracle cure. Sophie needs something to hope for beyond just buying time, Robert admitted quietly. The modified treatment is a compromise that preserves her abilities temporarily, but eventually we'd face the same choice again, normalizing her brain function or watching her condition deteriorate. Hope is powerful medicine in itself, Catherine observed. Just don't let it delay necessary treatment if this research option isn't viable. By mid-afternoon, the video consultation with Dr. Camila Santos had been arranged. The Brazilian neurologist, a poised woman in her 50s with streaks of silver in her dark hair, greeted Sophie with genuine warmth. I've heard so much about you from Minister Mendez, Dr. Santos said. He tells me you have an extraordinary ability to understand cultural and linguistic patterns that others miss. Sophie nodded shyly. I can hear what people mean, not just what they say. That's a beautiful way to describe it, Dr. Santos smiled. I've reviewed the medical records you shared, and I have a few thoughts about your condition and treatment options, if you'd like to hear them. Robert, sitting beside Sophie, nodded. Please. What the Swiss clinic calls a rare neurological disorder could also be viewed as an atypical but potentially valuable neural development pattern, Dr. Santos explained. In our research, we found that the brain sometimes creates alternate pathways that process information differently. Not better or worse, just differently. These pathways can create challenges in some areas, but extraordinary abilities in others. Sophie leaned forward, captivated. Like how I can understand languages and feelings really well, but sometimes get confused or have headaches? Exactly, Dr. Santos confirmed. Our approach differs from traditional treatment in that we don't necessarily aim to normalize brain function. Instead, we try to stabilize the challenging aspects while preserving the unique neural pathways that create special abilities. Robert felt a flicker of hope, quickly tempered by caution. Dr. Hoffman at the Swiss clinic has proposed a modified treatment that would temporarily preserve Sophie's abilities while stabilizing her condition. But she's made it clear this is only a stopgap measure, not a long-term solution. Dr. Santos nodded thoughtfully. The approach Dr. Hoffman suggests is sound, based on current mainstream neurological practice. What we're developing in Sao Paulo is more experimental, focusing on targeted neural pathway stabilization rather than broader restructuring. Could your approach offer a longer-term solution? Robert asked, careful to keep his tone neutral despite the hope rising in his chest. Potentially, Dr. Santos acknowledged. We've had promising results with several patients whose conditions share similarities with Sophie's. But I must emphasize that our approach is still experimental, and I would not recommend delaying Dr. Hoffman's treatment to pursue this alternative without careful coordination between both medical teams. Sophie, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Could you work with Dr. Hoffman? Like a collaboration? Dr. Santos smiled at the child's practical suggestion. That's exactly what I was going to propose. I'd like to consult with Dr. Hoffman about incorporating some of our targeted stabilization techniques into her modified treatment protocol. This might extend the period of stability beyond the 3 to 5 years she's currently projecting, while we continue developing our approach. Robert exchanged a glance with Catherine, who had joined them for the consultation. That sounds promising, he said carefully. But would Dr. Hoffman be open to this kind of collaboration? Most medical professionals are willing to consider additional perspectives, especially for rare conditions, Dr. Santos assured him. With your permission, I'll reach out to her directly to discuss the possibilities. After receiving Robert's consent, Dr. Santos turned her attention to Sophie. Now, Sophie, would you mind telling me more about how your special abilities work? The more I understand about your neural processing patterns, the better we can tailor any treatment approach. For the next half hour, Sophie described her experiences, how languages seemed to reveal their patterns to her, how she recognized emotional undertones in communication, how she could identify cultural references that others missed. Pashwantos listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her genuine interest and expertise. As the consultation concluded, Dr. Santos made a final observation that stayed with Robert long afterward. Sophie's mind isn't broken. It's different in a way that offers unique value to the world. Our goal should be to help her live healthily with this difference, not erase what makes her special. The words resonated deeply with Robert, articulating what he had felt but struggled to express. His daughter wasn't a problem to be fixed, but a gift to be protected and nurtured, challenges and all. After the call ended, Sophie turned to her father, her eyes bright with renewed hope. Dr. Santos understands, Dad. She doesn't want to make me normal. She wants to help me stay me. She certainly seems to have a different perspective than some of the doctors we've talked to, Robert agreed cautiously. But let's see what Dr. Hoffman says about the collaboration before we get too excited. Sophie nodded, but her spirits remained high as they rejoined the Brazilian delegation to continue the final project preparations. The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity, finalizing the cultural framework documentation, completing the acoustic modification specifications, and preparing the community integration protocols. By early evening, as the workday was winding down, Robert received an unexpected call from Dr. Hoffman. Catherine offered her office for privacy, and Robert took the call with Sophie by his side. Mr. Foster, Dr. Hoffman greeted him, her tone professional but not unkind. I've spoken with Dr. Santos about her proposed collaboration. Already? Robert couldn't hide his surprise. That was quick? Dr. Santos is well respected in neurological research circles, Hoffman explained. And given the time-sensitive nature of Sophie's treatment, we both felt it was important to connect promptly. And what do you think of her approach? Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Hoffman was quiet for a moment. Her research is innovative and shows promise, particularly for cases like Sophie's, where the neurological variation creates both challenges and unique cognitive advantages. I believe a collaborative approach could potentially offer better outcomes than either of us could achieve independently. Robert felt Sophie squeeze his hand tightly. So what does this mean for Sophie's treatment plan? I propose we proceed with the modified treatment as scheduled, but incorporate some of Dr. Santos's targeted stabilization techniques. This would still require beginning treatment immediately, but might extend the period of stability beyond our initial projections. And long-term, Robert pressed, is there any possibility that Sophie could maintain her abilities permanently while still addressing her condition? Dr. Hoffman's response was measured. It would be irresponsible to make promises about permanent solutions at this stage. However, this collaboration opens possibilities that weren't available before. Dr. Santos's team will continue their research while Sophie undergoes the initial treatment phase, and we can adjust the approach as new data becomes available. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was something Sophie had lacked before, a path forward that didn't inevitably lead to losing her special abilities. A chance, however small, that she might not have to choose between who she was and how long she lived. Thank you, Dr. Hoffman, Robert said sincerely. We'll see you tomorrow as planned. After ending the call, Sophie threw her arms around her father's neck. Did you hear that, Dad? They're going to work together. I might get to keep being me. It's definitely good news, Robert agreed, hugging her tightly while still trying to manage expectations. But remember, sweetheart, this is still experimental. We need to be prepared for all possibilities. I know, Sophie said, pulling back to look at him seriously. But now there's hope. Real hope, not just buying time. The word hung in the air between them. Hope, that most powerful and dangerous of emotions. Robert had been careful about hope since Charlotte's illness, knowing how cruelly it could be dashed. But seeing the light in Sophie's eyes, he couldn't bring himself to temper her optimism. Perhaps hope was what she needed most right now. More than caution, more than realism. Yes, he agreed, smoothing her hair. There's hope. The story of Sophie's accelerated treatment timeline and the unexpected collaboration between Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Santos spread quickly through the project team. The evening that had been planned as a simple farewell dinner for the Brazilian delegation transformed into a celebration, not just of the successful project completion, but of new possibilities for Sophie's future. The restaurant Catherine had reserved was decorated with tropical flowers in honor of the Brazilian guests. As the teams gathered, there was none of the usual corporate formality. The weeks of intense collaboration had forged genuine bonds between the American and Brazilian teams, with Sophie and Robert at the heart of this unexpected connection. Minister Mendez arrived fashionably late, his formal demeanor softened by obvious affection for the group. He made his way directly to Sophie's table, presenting her with a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. A gift from the indigenous communities, he explained as Sophie carefully opened it. Inside lay a delicate bracelet made of wooden beads and natural fibers, each bead carved with symbols representing water, speech, and healing. The elders asked me to tell you that this is a speaker's bracelet, Mendez explained. In their tradition, it is given to those who have the gift of true communication, not just words, but understanding. They believe it offers protection to those who bridge worlds. Sophie slipped the bracelet onto her wrist with reverence. Please tell them thank you. I'll wear it during my treatment. Rodriguez raised his glass in a toast. To Sophie Foster, who taught us that the most important element in any water system isn't the pipes or filters, but the understanding between the people who build it and those who will live with it. Glasses clinked around the room as Sophie blushed, unaccustomed to being the center of such attention. Robert watched his daughter, marveling at how this shy, serious child had so profoundly affected these accomplished professionals. Isabella, who had been documenting the project's environmental aspects, presented Sophie with a leather-bound journal filled with pressed flowers and birds' feathers from the project regions, for you to remember the places your work will protect, even when you are far away in Switzerland. As the dinner progressed, Catherine stood to make an announcement. I'd like to share some news that I think will please everyone here. Reynolds Water Solutions, in partnership with the Brazilian Ministry of Water Resources, is establishing a new division focused exclusively on culturally integrated water projects. This division will apply Sophie's cultural bridge methodology to all future international water initiatives. She paused, looking directly at Robert. And I'm pleased to announce that Robert Foster has agreed to join us as Director of Field Implementation and Training, bringing his practical expertise to ensure our systems work as well in reality as they do on paper. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, particularly from the technical teams who had come to respect Robert's hands-on approach to engineering challenges. Robert felt a rush of mixed emotions, pride in this professional recognition, hope for financial security for himself and Sophie, and lingering anxiety about balancing this new role with Sophie's uncertain medical journey. Catherine wasn't finished. Additionally, we're establishing the Sophie Foster Fellowship for Cultural Integration in Engineering, an educational initiative that will train engineers and translators to work together using Sophie's methodology. The fellowship will sponsor 10 students annually from indigenous and underserved communities around the world. Sophie's eyes widened at this news. A fellowship with my name? She whispered to her father. Does that mean my ideas will keep helping people even when I'm in Switzerland? That's exactly what it means, sweetheart, Robert confirmed, his throat tight with emotion. Your work will continue even when you can't be directly involved. As the evening wound down, Rodriguez approached Robert with one final surprise. We have arranged something special for tomorrow morning, before your flight. The indigenous representatives would like to perform a traditional blessing ceremony for Sophie's journey to Switzerland. It is their way of sending strength and protection with her. That's incredibly thoughtful, Robert said, touched by the gesture. What time should we be ready? 7 o'clock at the Riverside Park near your apartment, Rodriguez replied. It will be brief but meaningful, I promise. As they said their goodbyes for the evening, Catherine walked Robert and Sophie to the car she had arranged to take them home. Everything is set for your flight tomorrow afternoon. My assistant will meet you at the airport with all the necessary documents and arrangements. Catherine, I don't know how to thank you, Robert began, but she waved away his words. No thanks necessary. What Sophie has done for this project, for this company, is beyond value. The least we can do is ensure she gets the best possible care. She knelt to Sophie's level. And you, young lady, have a standing job offer when you are well enough to take it. No one translates hearts and minds like you do. Sophie smiled tiredly, but with genuine pleasure. Thank you for believing in me. Not many grown-ups would listen to an 8-year-old. Not many 8-year-olds have what you have, Catherine replied simply. Now get some rest. Tomorrow is a big day. Back at their apartment, Robert helped an exhausted Sophie prepare for bed. As he tucked her in, she looked up at him with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Dad? Are you scared about the treatment? Robert considered deflecting with reassurance, but opted for honesty instead. Sophie deserved that much. Yes, sweetheart, I am. But I'm also hopeful. More hopeful than I was before today's call with Dr. Santos. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. I'm scared too, but also excited, kind of, like when you're about to go on a really big roller coaster. The comparison made Robert smile despite his anxiety. That's a good way to put it. Dad? Sophie's voice was growing sleepy. What Mom said before she died about measuring life by heart given, not time. I think I understand that better now. These past few weeks, helping with the water project, it feels like I've given a lot of heart. Even if the treatment doesn't work perfectly, that matters, right? Robert's throat constricted with emotion. It matters enormously, Sophie. You've given more heart in your 8 years than most people give in a lifetime. And you're going to give more heart too with your new job, Sophie murmured, her eyes drifting closed. You'll help make sure water systems actually work for real people. That's important. Get some sleep now, Robert whispered, kissing her forehead. Tomorrow's a big day. After Sophie fell asleep, Robert sat on their small balcony, looking out at the Portland skyline. The past few weeks had transformed their lives in ways he could never have anticipated that day in the hospital waiting room. What had begun as a desperate hope for treatment, money had evolved into something far more profound, a mission that had given Sophie's unique abilities purpose and meaning, and had opened unexpected doors for both of them. He thought about Catherine's job offer, which he had accepted almost without thinking. After years of seeing himself primarily as Sophie's father and protector, the recognition of his own professional value was both surprising and affirming. Whatever happened with Sophie's treatment, he would have meaningful work that utilized his practical skills to help others, a purpose beyond the all-consuming focus on his daughter's condition. And Sophie, his extraordinary, brave, wise beyond her years daughter, had found a way to leave a lasting legacy regardless of what happened with her treatment. Her cultural bridge methodology would continue helping communities long after they left for Switzerland. Her insights into cross-cultural communication preserved and passed on to others through the fellowship bearing her name. Robert hadn't allowed himself to think too far ahead, to imagine what life might be like after treatment, whether Sophie would retain her unique abilities or become, as she put it, a different Sophie. But tonight, for the first time, he found himself cautiously imagining a future where the collaboration between Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Santos might actually succeed in preserving what made Sophie special while addressing the neurological challenges of her condition. It wasn't certainty, not even close, but it was possibility, and sometimes possibility was enough to build hope upon. Dawn broke clear and cool over Portland the next morning. Robert and Sophie arrived at the Riverside Park just as the sun was beginning to paint the water with golden light. Rodriguez, Isabella, and the indigenous representatives were already there, along with Catherine and several members of the project team who had come to say a final farewell. The blessing ceremony was simple but profound. The eldest representative, speaking in his native dialect with Isabella translating, thanked Sophie for hearing the voice of the river in the heart of his people. He spoke of water as the great connector, flowing between communities just as understanding flows between cultures. Sophie stood silently, the wooden beaded bracelet on her wrist catching the early morning light. When the elder finished speaking, he presented her with a small vial of river water. To remind you that waters from many places become one river, just as words from many hearts become one understanding, Isabella translated. Carry this with you to Switzerland, and remember that water always finds its path, even through the hardest stone. Sophie accepted the vial with solemn dignity. I'll remember, she promised, and I'll come back someday to see the water system working and the birds in their sanctuary. As the sun climbed higher, goodbyes were exchanged, with promises of updates and future collaboration. Catherine confirmed that she would be in regular contact during Sophie's treatment, coordinating between the medical teams and keeping the project moving forward. The next time you see these systems, they'll be built and operating, she promised Sophie, clean water flowing to communities that have waited generations for it. As they prepared to leave for the airport, Rodriguez embraced Robert warmly. You have raised an extraordinary daughter, my friend. She has the rarest of gifts, the ability to truly hear others. Whatever happens with her treatment, that gift has already changed the world in ways that will outlast all of us. The words stayed with Robert as they made their final preparations, packed their bags, and headed to the airport. Sophie was quiet during the drive, clutching her wooden bird carving from Isabella and occasionally touching the vial of river water now hanging on a cord around her neck. Nervous? Robert asked gently. A little, Sophie admitted, but also ready, I think. We've done what we needed to do here. Now it's time for the next part. At the airport, Catherine's assistant met them as promised, guiding them efficiently through check-in and security. As they waited at the gate for their flight to Zurich, Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Hoffman. Spoke again with Dr. Santos this morning. Very promising collaboration developing. Looking forward to meeting Sophie tomorrow. Robert showed the message to Sophie, whose face brightened. See, Dad? They're already working together. That's good, right? It's very good, Robert agreed, allowing himself to share in her optimism, if only for this moment. As their boarding group was called, Sophie gathered her few personal items. The journal from Isabella, the bird carving, her tablet with translation notes she refused to leave behind. She paused, looking back at the terminal as if memorizing it. Ready? Robert asked, offering his hand. Sophie nodded, her small fingers wrapping around his. Ready. As they walked down the jetway toward the plane that would carry them to Switzerland and whatever future awaited there, Sophie spoke so softly Robert almost didn't hear her. The water keeps flowing, Dad. That's what matters. Robert squeezed her hand, his throat too tight for words. The water would indeed keep flowing. In Brazil, in communities around the world, and in the legacy of understanding that Sophie had created with her unique ability to hear the heart behind the words. Whatever the treatment outcome, Sophie Foster had already changed the world in ways that would outlast her condition, perhaps even her lifetime. She had built bridges between cultures, between minds, between different ways of seeing the world, bridges that would stand long after they were gone. As they boarded the plane, the sun broke through Portland's clouds one last time, catching the river water in Sophie's vial and sending rainbow prisms dancing across her face. She smiled up at her father, suddenly looking like any excited 8-year-old embarking on an adventure. Switzerland is going to be amazing, she declared with unexpected enthusiasm. And when I'm better, or even if I'm different, we'll still be together, right? Still Team Foster? Always, Robert promised, his heart full as he helped her settle into her seat. Always Team Foster. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, carrying them toward uncertainty, toward hope, toward whatever future awaited. Robert glanced at Sophie, who had already opened her Brazilian bird book, her fingers tracing the colorful illustrations as the engines roared to life. Sophie's light had burnt bright enough to kindle countless others, and whatever happened next, that light would continue to shine. In the water flowing through Brazilian communities, in the cultural bridge methodology that would transform international projects, and in the heart of a father who had learned from his extraordinary daughter that life isn't measured in years, but in bridges built and hearts touched along the way.